Hi, everybody, and welcome to this, our second week of our new study that we've been doing before Lent by Frederick Buechner, A Crazy Holy Grace. As we move into our second lesson, I hope that you've taken the time to look at the first one and have done the work in the participant's guide. I remind you that this session or this series actually is using two books. The one that I asked you to get was the participant's guide, in which it kind of has the questions for self-reflection for you to do as you move through that and read that. And the other part, if you wanted it, and which really the whole thing is based upon, is a book by the same title by Frederick Buechner. And there are still these available at the church outside in the wire racks by the worship center if you're here locally. And if not, you can certainly get those through Kindle if you'd like to participate in them. And we're sort of doing things in reverse. Normally I ask people to read before a class begins, and then we kind of build upon that. But we're more coming into material raw and new, and then I'm asking you to reflect upon it after the fact. This is not a typical Lenten series in the fact that we're not talking about Jesus last week on earth and all the things that were a part of the Holy Week and the resurrection experience, but we're talking about something that was very central to that Holy Week story, and that is pain and grief. We know that the disciples had much pain and grief that took place during this time as they're witnessing the letting go of this most beloved leader that they've come to know. We know that Jesus himself felt the pain, the grief, the lostness that he was experiencing, and grieved also for the grief that his friends were going to bear, with him leaving. We know that his mother was at the tomb, and we can sense, if anyone can sense how painful that must have been for a mother to watch her beloved son being treated so cruelly. But pain and grief are universal. Things have changed. We don't crucify people in our world. We don't know that to some extent. And yet there's extraordinary pain that people are enduring, physical pain, emotional pain, spiritual pain. So it is very much a part of who we are. And there's no one that is exempt from it. You can't buy no pain insurance necessarily. You can do all that you can to try to mitigate or to keep pain from happening to you. But sometimes we just aren't in control of all those situations. And so that's kind of the focus that we're moving into this with. And so as we prepare for me to share my screen with you and move into it, I hope that you have your Bibles handy and you have your participant guide handy, if you'll have that nearby too, because we're going to reference both of those as we move into this one. This particular chapter of the text is the second chapter of your participant's guide. If you have the other textbook part of it, it's also the second chapter in that book. And it is the chapter name that gives the book its title, A Crazy Holy Grace. And that will maybe you'll understand the whole topic and point of this book as we move into talking about what does the author mean by this idea of a crazy holy grace. So as we pick up with our lesson today, I want us to pause for a moment. I want you to pause, and within your own mind and memory, I want you to think of a time or a place of your life that just seemed ideal. Maybe it was a time in your life where you had a childlike innocence or naivete about you. It could be a place that brings you great comfort. If you're getting that into your mindset, I want you to imagine the scene that if someone else were looking at it, what would they notice about it? What sticks out in your memory about this particular place or this particular scene? And I want you to think about the weather. Was it hot? Was there a breeze? Was it the sun shining or was it an overcast day? Was there snow on the ground? Was the temperature hot, cold, lukewarm, or that perfect temperature, whatever that might be for you? Think about yourself in that. Do you feel your shoulders lessening maybe from the stress of the day as you think about that scene? And does it well up within you if that was the perfect time? That was a place of contentment. Is there a taste or a smell associated with it? If you have that scene in your mind, I want you to think about this. Isn't it interesting how we can leave a place, but the place never leaves us? Whether that place was one like I just described that may bring you contentment and peace, and it's down in the deepest recesses, and you just think about it, and all those things that we talked about, the taste, the smell, the senses became alive as you re-entered that scene there. And our bodies and our minds throughout our lifetime begin to bring those in and catalog them, if you will. And so what happens then over time is one scene begins to influence another scene of life. Let me give you an example. I can walk into a hospital, and there's a smell about a hospital. Doesn't matter where it is, what city it's in, how large or small it is, there is something about the smell, feel of a hospital that if you were blindfolded, you would say, I feel like I'm in a hospital. And being in that hospital for that moment will engage in your memory times where you've also been in a hospital. It could be for a loved one, that you've been with during their time of illness, or even a passing of a loved one. It could be just your visiting of a friend. But everything gets entangled. One memory of going into a hospital with another one gets entangled. And you'll see different scenes in that hospital that will evoke yet a different kind of memory within there. And it will take you back, and you'll begin again to process that memory. Having had a career in teaching prior to entering ministry, I have that feeling with schools. I think every school kind of has its own special smell about it, but all of them have the same taint. It's a little bit of cleaner. It's kind of a spoiled milk smell. It's a sweaty body smell. Sometimes it's a little smell of someone being sick, that and the disinfectant and all. It's like it's a smell that you can just guess when you go in there that, oh, that's a school. And when you smell that, memories of your school will come back. Memories of your place, memories and sights and scenes from your own. And we begin to process those and meld those together with our current scene. But sometimes the glory of looking back and of melding those scenes together is new clarity comes to us about that particular time and why that time was horrendous or stressful or beautiful and magical. For me, if I'm out on a fall day or a late summer day, it's more likely, and it's hot, and I come across a field that's just been fresh mown, I'm almost in a whiff of an air taken back to my grandparents' farm, for that would be the time that we would often be on the farm. And I remember helping my grandfather put up hay, which you only do on hot, dry days. There was a smell about that, and every memory of those particular days come back. Maybe the whiff of an evergreen takes you to Christmas, but you get my point that we are built of memories, and one memory begins to influence another. Well, the reason I'm talking about all of this is that in today's study, we were having an excerpt from, I told you that this book is a series of essays from Buechner, and this particular chapter is an excerpt from his autobiography, which is entitled The Sacred Journey. And he spends a lot of time in this chapter looking back on his childhood memories, and he remembers them in great detail, as great writers can do, in putting that forward. And they indicate, though, that his memories of certain things became clearer over time. And the reason he looks back at this is because he believes that when things happen, we may not fully understand them, but God is still in that. And throughout our life, God continues to speak wisdom into that event, which we may not have seen or missed at the very time. This is what he would say. It's like this, that God speaks through our lives, but that we can only discern God's message after many years and many further spellings out of it. Meaning that we understood to a point in the time that we were, but as time passes, we also begin to understand some of those things better. So let me give you an example. As I was growing up, there's two memories that stick out in my head of my maternal grandmother and my mother. For my maternal grandmother, we would go to the farm and we would spend some time with her. And when I would get up in the morning, she was always sitting on the corner of a sofa. And on that table beside that sofa was her Bible and her Sunday school book. And every week she would spend time writing out that Sunday school lesson, writing the lesson itself, the scripture she would write out, and her reflections and answering the questions in her book. She would work on that throughout the week so that when Sunday came, she was prepared to go into her Sunday school room. She wasn't the teacher, she was just a well-prepared student. Well, fast forward, and I also in my house, growing up, my mother had a chair in the corner of our den, and beside that chair was a bookcase, and in that bookcase was a series of books that my mother would study. My mother so wanted to go to college, and her family could not afford for her to do so. So she was a self-learner. She taught herself algebra and other types of math. She taught herself even fun things, how to play bridge. And she was a wordsmith extraordinaire. So she loved games involving words and so forth. But she was a stay-at-home mom for most of my life, and she would work all day doing the things that moms who stay home do, serving others, working in the church, being a scout mother, all of those kind of things. But in the evening after supper, she would go to her chair. And in that chair, she sort of secluded herself into a solitude. We were all in the room and the television was on, but she was in her world. She was studying, she was learning, she was practicing whatever the skill that she was learning at the moment was, or she was practicing her skills in wordsmithing. I didn't fully understand either one of those women until I've entered into adulthood. When I entered into adulthood and became a mother myself, I understood my mother's need, that she'd given out all day long. She had served all day long, and she was recharging her batteries by going to that special chair and sitting there and learning and spending time in learnedness, and sometimes in scripture, sometimes in other things. And I know what that feels like because as a mother, a busy mother, who worked outside the home, but come the evening time, I needed that time to recharge. And my children often laugh that don't ever talk to mother after 10 o'clock. She's just not very good at it. I'd given out and I needed to pause and to just be. So for my grandmother, she was teaching me discipleship. She didn't know it, but she was discipling me because as I would watch her open the Bible and study, I realized it was more than just picking up this book and having it sitting there to look pretty on the table. The book's pages were to be worn, they were to be looked at over and over, they were to be reflected upon and written upon. See, those memories that were locked in my head of these two women were there, but I did not fully understand them until many years and further spellings out. And in understanding them, I understood me better. And not only did I understand me better, but I understand God's presence better. Because now I understand and can probably give a lot more grace to my mother and grandmother for what they were doing at that time than I could have had I not become this thing myself. And so that's the staying power of memories and how we continue to build upon them. And you probably have stories of your own way, things that maybe you've looked back upon a parent or a grandparent or a brother or sister, and you've seen with greater clarity the more distance you got from it than you could possibly understand at the moment. But God is still at work in those memories. God is still teaching us in those memories as we move forward. Well, for Buechner, one of the most critical memories of his life was not a beautiful one like mine of my mother and grandmother. Instead, his would come in his father's suicide. He describes the details of that in great detail in his book. And all the nuances tell me that he spent a lot of time in that memory. He can tell you where he and his brother were. In fact, they were up, it was a Saturday morning, and they were up being quiet before the rest of the household got up, and they were playing, of all things, a roulette wheel. I've sort of laugh about that because I'm thinking, how many kids have a roulette wheel, particularly in that period of time? Because remember, I told you last week he's 94, so that would tell you how long ago that was. But they were playing with the roulette wheel. And he said he never forget it because his father opened the door and he looked in and he didn't say anything. He just looked at the boys. They looked at him, went on playing their game, and he quietly closed the door and left. It would be a hubbub of activity within an hour, where he would hear people shriek and scream and noises being made and people coming up and down from their driveway to discover that his father had committed suicide by carbon monoxide poisoning. And he would call that time like his before and after. That's not the words he used. Whereas he thought there was a once upon a time and then there was a once under time. And so for him, his once upon a time became a once under time after this devastating change in his family circle. So this is what he would write about it. He said, "A child takes life as it comes because he has no other way of taking it. The world has come to an end that Saturday morning, but each time we had moved to another place, I'd seen a world come to an end, and there'd always been another world to replace it." I paused here to remind you that for the first 14 years of his life, he lived in 14 different places. And he said, "When someone you love dies," Mark Twain said, "it is like when your house burns down, and it isn't for years that you realize the full extent of your loss. For me, it was longer than for most, if indeed I have even fully realized it yet. And in the meanwhile, the loss came to get buried so deep in me that after a time, I scarcely ever took it out to look at it at all, let alone to speak." So when we talk about the house burning down and you don't know the loss, the full extent of it, it's because it is until you needed that thing in your house, till you remembered that you had a need for it, maybe you didn't realize that it was gone. And when children in particular lose a father, no matter what the age, every big event is the resurfacing of that loss because you know, oh, they weren't here for this and this and this. And I think that is that to which he speaks. But he says, for him, it just got so buried because it was something, and as we'll talk about, he's not necessarily going to handle it as well as he could. But part of it for children, and really for lots of adults, is when is it that you discovered that life didn't go the way that you thought it was going to go, that your mortality was ever more evident, and that, what was before will never be the same. It will never go back to that. It will never go back to that innocence. It'll never go back to that naivete. It will never go back to that feeling that you had before this huge event happened. And so, and that's when pain falls on you and how you begin to cope with that, or as we said last week, become a steward of it. How are you going to use that pain? Are you going to allow it to lock you away? Are you going to deny it? Are you going to pass it off as if it's nothing? What are you going to do with that particular pain? How are you going to steward it? And, and you realize too, in that erasing of that innocence, that sometimes the world makes no sense because you grow up and you want to believe that as long as you're good and you do everything right, then all the goodness will come to you. There won't be any unjustness or unfairness or things that happen. And that's how the world makes sense to you. And suddenly when something happens to someone that was dear to you, somehow the world no longer makes any sense. I had that very experience myself. My grandmother had passed, but my grandmother was 66. But, there's a thing about grandmothers, no matter how old they are, you think they're old. And my grandmother had had some health issues, and she was the first person very close to me that passed away. And I remember being able to process that to some degree. I was very saddened by her loss. I was very, close to her, and that saddened me. But in my head, I could make sense of it because this is what happens to older people. But I would be knocked on my heels much later when my best friend through junior high and into high school up to our junior year, and then her family moved to Alabama. Her father was transferred. And it was in our first year of college, she at the University of Alabama in Huntsville and mine at UT Knoxville. I would learn on one weekend that she had been murdered. And my world of right and wrong, just and unjust, simply fell apart. For this was, a beautiful, beautiful family, a faithful family, a servant family. When I would go to her home to spend the night as we were teenagers, I would pass her parents' room and they'd be on their knees beside one another praying. This was a set of parents that protected their daughter and brought her up with learning to play the violin and to study hard and to be good to people and to serve other people. This is not the family that you would think that such a horrendous crime would be committed against. And how does a mind make sense of that? Well, the reality is we have to make sense of that, don't we? Because what we learn in those things is that there's things that happen that are just and things that happen that are unjust, fair and unfair. And it doesn't matter who we are. And they bring with us then maybe new feelings that we didn't experience before. So pain opens up lots of different things that happen within our life. And it brings about these unsettling moments. Now, there are times when pain, particularly a death or a loss, comes, and we're trying to explain it in our head. I've often met with people when they learn that someone's died, the first thing they said is, "Oh, I wish I had," which tells me their first entrance into that pain is about regret. And there were others who said, "Oh, I'm so glad that we were able to take that trip, be together for Christmas last year," all these kind of things. And in this last year, I've heard a lot of that language because a lot of people, as they moved into the holidays, thought, "Well, I wish I'd known last year would have been our last Christmas together," or whatever the event may be. Sometimes it's bitterness or anger. How dare God allow this crime to happen against this very special person, or this illness to overtake them that just doesn't seem fair? Well, all of those things in some way were with Buechner, but he had another one. And that is because his father committed suicide, he also had an emotion of shame to deal with. He didn't know how to process that. People don't kill themselves. That brings shame upon the family, particularly in the early 1900s, in his time of life, but unfortunately more so today. It's the same shame that parents will experience if they have to tell someone that their child is in addiction of any kind, or that their child stole from them, or things that have lost and taken away the naivete and innocence, that pain that is so deep that I can't even speak of it. And so I make it something else. And he would tell people that his father died of a heart attack. Somehow that made it more acceptable. But then that builds the grief and loss, because I've lost being able to be true, to be authentic. And so anytime we have these painful experiences and we bear this grief and loss, it changes us, it morphs us, it changes our expectations, if you will. And, and we bring into that situation anybody that we meet who may be going into a similar thing, our own experiences. And so we put upon them sometimes our feelings about the death of that one, or our understandings about it. And sometimes that does more harm than good, as in the case we talked about last week with Job. Well, so where does that leave us? Well, I'm going to take you to a very different passage today, and it's in the book of Ecclesiastes. And I dare say you haven't heard many sermons on this particular chapter, because I'll tell you it's a downer if you go to read it. The book of Ecclesiastes begins with these words: "Meaningless, meaningless, all life is meaningless." And as we move into the 9th chapter, things haven't gotten any better. Let me share that with you today. So I reflected on all this, and what we're talking about, the I here, is the writer of this book. I'll talk about him in just a minute. So I reflected on all this and concluded that the righteous and the wise and what they do are in God's hand, but no one knows whether love or hate awaits them. All share a common destiny. And here's the destiny he's speaking of: the righteous, the wicked, the good, the bad, the clean, the unclean, those who offer sacrifice and those who do not. As it is with the good, so with the sinful. As it is with those who take oaths, so with those who are afraid of them. Meaning that it's going to happen no matter which side of any situation that you're on. He says, this is the evil in everything that happens under the sun. The same destiny overtakes it all. The hearts of people, moreover, are full of evil, and there is madness in their hearts while they live, and afterward they join the dead. Anyone who is among the living has hope. Even a live dog is better off than a dead lion. For the living know they will die, but the dead know nothing. They have no further reward, and even their name is forgotten. Their love, their hate, and their jealousy have long since vanished. Never again will they have part in anything that happens under the sun. So go eat your food with gladness and drink your wine with a joyful heart, for God has already approved what you do. Always be clothed in white and always anoint your head with oil. Enjoy life with your wife, with whom you love, all the days of this meaningless life that God has given you under the sun, all your meaningless days. For this is your lot in life and in your toilsome labor under the sun. Whatever your hand finds to do, do it with all your might. For in the realm of the dead, where you are going, there is neither working, nor planning, nor knowledge, nor wisdom. I have seen something else under the sun. The race is not to the swift, or the battle to the strong, nor does food come to the wise, or wealth to the brilliant, or favor to the learned. But time and chance happen to them all. Moreover, no one knows when their hour will come. As fish are caught in a cruel net, or birds taken in a snare, so people are trapped by evil times that fall unexpectedly on them. Told you it was an uplifting one, right? Basically, it's the same thing, but with more clarity. Meaningless, meaningless, all life is meaningless. It doesn't seem to matter if you're rich or poor, clean or unclean, if you've been just or unjust. It just seems like we're just all up to a random chance as to what happens to you. And this is what I'm going to tell you, that once you're dead, therefore you better eat, drink, and be merry in the process. Because, it's all coming to the same point and to the same end. Well, if you look at this, according to the author of this test, what levels all humanity makes everyone ultimately the same? Death. Death. It's just the ultimate universal thing that's going to come to everybody. And so therefore, and you just don't know what else is going to happen to you, eat, drink, and be merry. You wondered where they got that particular scripture, don't you? And the question is then, how do we struggle with that? How do we struggle, with this text? How do we struggle with, well, is all life meaningless? But that's not it. What we're struggling with is, why is it that when we come back to that scripture and it says that the race isn't for the one who could run the best, the battle isn't always won by the one who's strongest. Just because you're wise doesn't mean that you have food, or because you're learned that you're going to be wealthy. It seems random as to who gets what and how do you get it. I was on the phone just today with a person who has a passing in their family, and they made this comment to me. They said, it's just one of those families. It just seems like nothing ever went right. And you wonder why. They're good people. Why have they had so much trouble? Why? And we struggle with that because we want to believe that, well, if I do everything good and I am just, why does this kind of thing happen? And so therefore he says, well, we don't know why is what the writer's saying. So you might as well just enjoy life, because it just seems to fall happenstance, if you will, or by circumstance, random chance with that. Now, does that surprise you to find this author's view on life and death and chance in our Bible? It seems out of character, doesn't it? Well, I want to pause here for a minute to talk about the Book of Ecclesiastes. For a long time, people thought that Solomon wrote this particular book because it was written during a time, believe it or not, of great wealth in the United Kingdom. It was before the separation of the kingdom. And there was a lot of goodness being passed around, a lot of monies. People were pretty well off. Not everyone. A lot were on the backs. A lot of that was won on the backs of other people. And it's kind of like the more people got, the more dissatisfied they became. Sound a little familiar? But it was kind of like, well, we've got all this stuff. But you know what? It does seem like this stuff isn't protecting me. This stuff isn't making me feel fulfilled. It's not showing me what my purpose is in life. I've got more and more and more, and yet I have more and more discontent. And it reminds me of that old Peggy Lee song, which some of you may be familiar with, but by some other author, but it's basically, is that all there is? Okay, I've done this and this and this. And so the writer is writing, yeah, you've done all this, and guess what? The same end is going to come to everybody. Well, modern scholarship has really doubted that it was Solomon who wrote it, but instead they've given it the name Koheleth. And in that, it's a sort of a philosophical statement. And in the Hebrew Bible, this is grouped in what we call wisdom literature. It's the same grouping that we find the book of Job in. And what these do is they begin to uh, articulate questions that the human mind has. Like I just said, well, is this the only reason I'm here is just to get lots of stuff and then die? Is that the point of it? And so, it may surprise you to find that, but it's a worthwhile question because what Job asked the question about was what he was writing about, he was questioning and wondering. And so for Bigner, he said, I don't think that it's just all a random chance is the right explanation. And that, well, yeah, all right, you got dealt the hand with a father that commits suicide. You got dealt the hand with a handicapped child. You got dealt the hand with, an inability to have the personality to keep a job. You got dealt the hand, just whatever we want to put in there. But both of them are wisdom literature. And what they're discerning is the order that God has woven into the fabric of creation. And how do we align that self? Well, see, we want to make life make sense, don't we? This friend that I was just talking to, it was the same thing. She was talking about the passing of this because it just makes no sense. And we've, who've been through COVID, it seems to make no sense. This person gets it, gets very sick. These people die from it. These people don't seem to. It makes no sense. And we want to make sense out of stuff. We want to make sense as, well, why does that person that gyps others and rides on the back of the oppressed live in this fine, lavish home while other people who are also hardworking just can't ever seem to get ahead? So we want to make sense because that's how we order our world on justice and fairness. So what we see in Job's story is he could not accept wisdom because he said, you've got to explain to me why people suffer. And this was the question he kept asking God. Well, I haven't done anything to deserve this. And that's that Old Testament philosophy that if you were ill, it was because God was displeased with you or that you had done something. And that's why his friends kept saying, just tell God what you did and ask for forgiveness. And Job's like, I can't think of anything that I did. And so I can't look to my friend who was murdered and look at her family and go, well, what did y'all do? Y'all must have done something. Otherwise, she wouldn't have been murdered. Does that make sense? Of course not. And so, but that's what Job is questioning: why do people suffer? Well, Ecclesiastes, the author is asking another kind of question. He said, I can't understand why some people who don't deserve the things they get in life get them, and why other people who don't deserve these things get them. And so it just must be the odd chance. And so if it's just, if you will, a crapshoot, meaning the game craps, it just depends upon how the dice are rolled as to what happens to you, then all life is meaningless. What's the point? I might as well just eat, drink, and be merry and not think about anything else. And so we come down to that thought process of, well, how do we make sense of the things that happen to the just and the unjust? And what the writer is, really telling us is that, you can't, it's not a meritocracy where if I do X amount of things, then I'll somehow protect myself. It doesn't matter how smart you are or intelligent you are, how strong you are. It doesn't matter the color of your skin, your ethnicity, your education level. Nothing that we can do can fully guard against a calamity. I can have all the insurance in the world on my house, but I cannot stop a tornado from blowing it down if one chooses to do so, right? I cannot control every other car on the road. And so if there's someone who, is not paying attention and drifts over and hits me, I can't do that. Doesn't matter how well insured I am. I can't protect all of those kind of things. No matter how smart I am, I can't stop all of those kind of things. And so we live wondering, well, what is the meaning and the purpose? And we can't escape mortality or even discern, well, when is that going to happen? So how do we live in the process? And the fact that, do you live looking over your shoulder, waiting for the next thing to happen to you? A lot of people, that's a source of our fear and anxiety. And so For the writer, he's just determined, no matter what you do, you're all just going to be dead and go to worms, and even a dead a live dog knows more than a dead lion, because for the writer here, once you're dead, and there is no more. Well, I don't know about you, but I don't find any sense that I was just placed here to suck up oxygen and the earth's resources, and then I'll go back into decay, into the ground. What was the point? What was the point of that life? Why was it necessary that I lived this many years? Might as well have been born and died on the first day, like some of those insects do. What's the point? So we have to wonder, well, surely there is more. There is more. And it's that memory thing that reminds us there's more, because we've got a faith that passes on from generation to generation, that reminds us that our purpose and our role here is to continue in that faith tradition, because we're God's workers in the kingdom. It's that faith tradition that reminds us that he is still in the midst of all of that. No, we can't discern our mortality or how long it's going to be. And the author is right from the standpoint of God does want us to eat and drink and be merry and enjoy our lives. We're also going to have to take, well, when we have these things happen, how can we use those to further and to better the kingdom? And so for Buechner, that would be learning to rely upon hope. And what he basically says is, I face the worst that can happen. The death of this parent of his, this trauma that's inflicted. And guess what? It didn't kill me. I was able to move on from that, and that the worst is not the end, because of this thing called hope. And for him, this would be where he would discover that hope, is an odd place, we might think. For him, it was in Bermuda. After his father passed away, his mother decided that she was going to take herself and her two boys and move to the island of Bermuda. Now, this is in Bermuda a couple of years before World War II. And he describes it with great candor and honesty. He said he said, who would have known that a salmon-colored house would be their place to begin the healing and hope process. And he will leave that place not fully healed. And we'll talk about that in just a minute. But the one who did not like the idea of them moving to Bermuda was his father's mother, his grandmother. And in many ways, he said it was a frivolous place to go at a grave time. It was no place to raise boys, and it was an escape. And she would tell him, she said, you should stay and face reality. And he said, well, his grandmother was right, of course, right in 100 ways and wrong in as many others. And so this is what he would begin to call Bermuda his land of Oz. He said she was right that reality can be harsh, that you shut your eyes to it only at your peril, because if you do not face up to the enemy in all his dark power, then the enemy will come up from behind some dark day and destroy you while you're facing the other way. So she was going to have to face this reality head on. He said, maybe if we had stayed home as she did and wept for my father there, we might have become the stronger for it, as certainly she became stronger herself, because in her chair by the window, she stared her doom straight in the eye, until finally she managed to stare it down altogether, to emerge doom-proof at last with even her mirth. What we learn in this is the different ways that people process and steward their pain. For her, she was going to take her pain and she was going to dig really, really deep. And by George, she was going to face this doom and she was going to move through it. This was not the path that Buechner's mother chose. For her to stay within that was to die in it, because she could not see and even begin to look past that into a different kind of life. And so he went on to speak about what his mother and kind of the difference between their grieving. And he has this to say. He said, to do for yourself the best you have in you to do, to grit your teeth and clench your fist in order to survive the world at its harshest and worst, is by that very act to be unable to let something be done for you and in you that is more wonderful still. So it's kind of like when you pull back into yourself and you fight through it, either you fight through it or you succumb to it, that we don't open ourselves up, that others can come alongside and practice that. And so he kind of learns this. He says, the trouble with steeling yourself against the harshness of reality, which is sort of the face that his mother took, is that same steel that secures your life against being destroyed, secures your life also against being opened up and transformed by the holy power and life itself comes from. And I love this, and I think this is something we can all learn from. You can survive on your own. You can grow strong on your own. You can even prevail on your own. And this is the clincher. But you cannot become human on your own. Because human is only human as it is in relationship with other people. So he goes on to relate this story. He says, surely that is why Jesus' sad joke, the rich man has had a hard time getting into paradise as that camel through the needle's eye, because with his credit card in his pocket. The rich man is so effective at getting for himself everything he needs that he does not see that what he needs more than anything else in the world can only be had as a gift. He does not see that the one thing a clenched fish cannot do is accept, even from le bon Dieu himself, meaning the good God, is a helping hand. So when we close back in and we say, I'm just going to fight through this by myself, or I'm just going to ignore it and hope that it goes away and push on, then we miss sometimes the helping hand of God. And that sometimes that helping hand of God comes through another person. And that's how we begin to find healing, in the midst of that. But I think it's important because one of the things we can, listen to people share their grief, but we can't ever fully understand someone else's pain or loss, whatever that may be. And we're not always talking about death here, but when people have an unfulfilled dream, when things did not go as they expected them to go, when they have been dealt a blow, that maybe it's a medical condition that has kept them from being something else that they wanted to be, or whether it is death itself, we all have to process that, with ourselves, with God, but also with the understanding hand of somebody else. Not that we tell someone else what to do, but you come alongside them in that and you help them to steward that, and you're stewarding your own pain back to them. Now, I can't go to somebody and go, they say, well, they've lost their brother. I can say, I know exactly how you feel. No, they don't. No, I don't. Because sibling relationships are between those two siblings. I can empathize because I have a similar type of relationship, but it is different. How people grieve their spouses or grieve that. I know there's times where people in this grandmother, like I said, she was very supportive of the family because she was the one who, for many of the years of his life, paid the rent on their home because the father could not always make that happen. She's the one who paid the rent on this house in Bermuda. So, I guess she had every right to say, I don't think this is a good idea. But look what she did. She gave her the ability to still do it because it seemed like what this mother needed, and it seemed like what her boys needed. And her boys needed a place to return to wonder and childhood and awe that they found there in Bermuda, because it was just a place so unlike any place that they'd ever been before. It gave them a place where everything wasn't a constant memory. And I have met people who have survived loss, but in a short period of time, they've moved. They say, I just can't stay there. I can't heal there because everything that happens opens that back. And so we don't know. We don't know what that looks like and what that feels like for different people. And so he goes on to say that, sometimes the getting away from is also, and that's an important word covered up here, a getting away to. When we get away from and we release maybe some of this pain and grief, where do we come? Well, for him, it would be beyond Bermuda. Like I said, this was a couple of years before World War II. And as World War II was getting underway, they received word that Bermuda was going to be captured, predicted to be captured by Germany, and they were going to use it as a submarine base. So all Americans were taken off the island. And he came back into much the same life he'd had before he left there. But how was it that he lived beyond Bermuda? Well, he didn't leave Bermuda all healed. He didn't leave, everything now taken care of himself. And even at 94, or at the time of writing his autobiography, he would say, I'm not sure I've still processed it all. Because as things became clearer by looking back and going back to that particular memory and everything else, and he has gotten older, clarity changes, from that. But he said what he did learn in that moment. At least his eyes began to seeing a way, anyway, that there's pain in every life, even the apparent luckiest, that buried griefs and hurtful memories are part of us all. So even though his had not fully healed, he had this new insight that he could look into others and going, well, I was naive that everyone has pain and loss. Everyone is suffering from something. And I'd never noticed that before. And so for him, he developed this compassion. And so this is where we get to our term, crazy holy grace. He said, and though they may well come by accident, these moments of our seeing, I choose to believe that it is by no means an accident when they open our hearts as well as our eyes. A crazy holy grace, I've called it. Crazy because whoever could have predicted it? Who can ever foresee the crazy how and when and where of a grace that wells up out of the lostness and pain of the world and of our inner worlds? And holy because these moments of grace come ultimately from farther away than Oz and deeper down than doom. Holy because they heal and hallow. For all thy blessings known and unknown, remembered and forgotten, we give thee thanks. And so for him, it's like, oh, well, now I can witness and see and understand and these passionate things about grace. And so it reminds me of a saying that you may have often heard or said yourself. You see a situation and it's a troubling situation, and you make this comment, there, but by the grace of God go I. Now, I've always been troubled by that because it sounds like, well, God's pouring out his grace on me, not you, you poor person who has this affliction. But I think if we look at it another way, is there, but by God's grace, I'm being able to see this. I'm being able to empathize. I'm being able to feel compassion. I'm being able to put myself in that person's shoes because in my memories, my pain, my heartache, I too have been there. And I've realized that had events gone very differently, or even somewhat differently, I would be there and they might be here. I've told this story, but I'll close as we kind of move into this. I went to a shelter. It's not a shelter anymore. It's actually a place where people who've been homeless for at least 3 years have a place to live. It's an apartment. And I went there with a friend who serves there as your chaplain, and I met a woman. And in the course of our conversation, I learned that as children, when she was the same age as me, and that we had lived in the same subdivision. My parents had rented a house there while we built a home, and that's the subdivision that she grew up in. And she was telling about her father and what her father did, and then she talked about her father had a hard life, and that she ended up not finishing high school, and she ended up getting married to a truck driver whom she desperately loved. And they had a good marriage. They had a son, and he was killed in a car accident, and everything went south. And she began to drink, and she began to be in such despair and despondency that her life unraveled to the point of where she now found herself. And it was not lost on me to think that one change of my circumstance growing up, and she and I would have the same story perhaps. One change. If my father had not been able to take care of his family, would I have finished high school? Who would I have married? It's different from the man that I married. See, it is about those things like that. And so when we realize those and we get those clarity, I love this, for blessings known and unknown. I didn't even think about the other children that grew up in that same neighborhood, or anyone to ever stop and think, where did their life turn? It's always been my heart for children who are born into difficult situations, because I can see from the beginning that life is always going to be hard. They begin school behind the 8 ball and they never get back in front of it. And so in these memories, we remember where we've received blessings, where things that we need to turn into a blessing, and where we get this crazy holy grace that comes upon us. And even grace in the midst of this sorrow reminds us that God is still in the midst of that God is still faithful in the midst of that God has not abandoned us, that the grace is still there, and we will see with more clarity. So I want to close with a scripture. I know you're familiar with it. It's often called the love chapter. It's in the 13th chapter of 1 Corinthians. And it's, love is, and it goes on to describe everything love is. And we often read it at weddings and so forth. But what I love about this passage is not that part. What I love is down toward the end. And I really want to talk about, starting with really verse 11. So when I was a child, I talked like a child, I thought like a child, I reasoned like a child. And when I became a man, I put away childhood behind me. For now we see only reflection as in a mirror, and then we shall see face to face. Now I know in part, and then I shall know fully, even as I am fully known. I want to circle back to our memory bank that we talked about already. See, when we start out into life and we have these memories, we only see in a portion of stuff. We're not seeing the full picture. We don't see how some event in our life has shaped and changed and maybe influenced our thinking. And the more we get, the older we get, the more that we see God's presence in that, the more we begin to see clarity. Like I said, it wasn't until I became a mother that I began to see my mother more clearly, or my grandmother, as I began particularly into the vocation of ministry and this daily practice and discipline. You see, I look back, I only saw dim things then, but God has shown me with clarity, well, this was significant to you because of this. And this is where I was still there with you, and we walked through you. And as I get to be more fully known, I more fully know. And so we begin to see that. And he said, he goes on, to make this. He said, we have a hard time seeing these moments and blessings as gifts. And, but we need to be seeing this message of hope and the healing and everything that comes from a part of that. I wanted to invite you, I'd like you to read this on your own, but in your participant's guide on pages 48 and 49, there's always a devotion that closes out the chapter. And this particular devotion speaks to Hebrews 11. Sometimes we call that the Hall of Faith, because it makes you look at all of these people of faith that you read throughout your Bible, and you see, what it is that has made them kind of a testimony. But I want to pull out one particular part of this. He said, in my better moments, I realized that the author who wrote this passage isn't really interested in showing off the heroes of faith, but the one in whom they had faith, one to whom they looked to and trusted their lives. Jesus, faith, pioneer, and perfecter. And I think about that writer of Ecclesiastes. He didn't have that vision, didn't have the Jesus Christ, didn't have the hope, that was a part of that. He had missed that he put all of his hero worship into things and ownership instead of putting himself into the hope that was Jesus. As we come back into this season of Lent, I'm looking at those disciples and their leader hanging on the cross, and them thinking, what has happened? But then they remembered that this was God, and that God was always faithful, and that God was still faithful, and God was still present in that. And each of those people named there, each of us who live beyond that, we follow our sacred journey. And it becomes more clear and evidence of God's presence, maybe when we could not see clearly. But the more we know, the more we will go forward into that journey. Well, that's where we stop today. So I invite you to join me again next week as we pick this back up for our third week. and it's called The Magical Room of Memories. So we'll continue to work upon that same topic there. So I hope that you will join me. It's been my pleasure to be with you, and I look forward to being a part of your next study. Thank you.